No, see, the problem is I can't rack another round into the chamber with these gloves on. It just it and if this mutates and goes zombie and hello, I didn't see you there. Um, how are you? Uh, as you're probably aware, there are a whole pile of coronavirus related reasons why we can't meet for the last few classes of terms. So my plan was to present the um, the lectures via video, and hopefully we'll be able to cover what we need to cover this week and next week, and it'll almost be like being there. So today, what I'm going to give you is a germ-free lecture. There are no viruses connected to this lecture. Um, so why don't we start? Okay, I'll just go to the change room here on the fabulous palatial mansion of the Perry family. And we'll meet back up and we'll talk about Get Out and representations of race in cinema. So, um, back in a minute. Okay, can you give me a hand getting this off? Because I So, welcome back. One of the great virtues of living here on the fabulous Perry Estates is that we have access to this terrific bunker, which my great 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 grandfather Aloysius Professor Perry built back in 1872 to fight against the possible zombie uprising that was anticipated on the Gulf Islands, which never arose. So he built this bunker, not really thinking about the fact that Windows made a bunker kind of useless. But at least we've got a bunker with windows in which to hide. So today, what we were going to focus on was the idea of representations of race in film. And I wanted to start with this quick quotation from Spike Lee, as I'm sure you're aware, the American director, who said America's biggest problem was race. And he said that always has been since we got off the boat, always will be. Now, Lee is focusing obviously on Hollywood and on America, but I think as we've seen by looking at Canadian cinema and the idea of the diasporic cinema in Canada and First Nations cinema in Canada, it's not an issue that's restricted to or limited to the United States, and obviously it's not an issue that's limited to Hollywood. That's something perhaps for us to keep in mind. One thing that I should mention is that I owe a special debt of thanks to the former TA for 295B, Shanice Walters, who did a fair bit of the research for this lecture and for these slides. So my thanks to her. So Hollywood is where we would typically focus for our discussion of American cinema, and yet it's worth remembering that that film in the United States didn't start in Hollywood, right? It primarily started on the East Coast in places like New Jersey and New York, and there was a pretty strong industry in the first decade and a half of film history that was located on the East Coast. But in the early 1910s, Hollywood started, American cinema started focusing on moving westward. And so we see a number of film production companies moving out west to California and ultimately settling in the area that's become known as Hollywood, it was originally Hollywood Land. Why did they move out there? Well, first off, there was a real sense that the landscape in the Hollywood area was much more varied than what they could find on the East Coast. So, they had access to beaches, which could, in theory at least, be transformed into tropical beaches on film. They had access to desert and mountains and cities and countryside and so on. So there was a sense that the landscape was much more varied. Also, there was a better quality of light and also longer days on the West Coast, especially obviously during the summertime. But the crucial thing that explains this move to the West Coast was the attempt to escape from patent controls that were introduced by Thomas Edison. Edison claimed to have invented motion pictures, and because of that claim, he filed a number of patents on the various machinery and so on, and even the techniques. So he imposed these patents, and then he actually had like these hired goons who would go out and smash up the equipment of competitors who were operating without Edison's permission. So one of the ways of escaping Edison's sort of, let's say, tyranny, although that's perhaps a bit strong, but one of the ways of escaping this was to move further west. So what we find is that the first studios in Hollywood start to appear around 1912. And by the 1920s, this is where the majority of film production in the United States is taking place. You may remember from a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that prior to World War I, France was the dominant film industry in the world. After World War I, it switches to the United States. And in the 1920s, the studio system kind of capitalized on this. Now, one of the things, and I know those of you who've taken 295A have already encountered this, but one of the things that guided the studio system was this policy of vertical integration, which meant that the studios owned the production facilities. They were in charge of the distribution of the films, which meant also the advertising and promotion of films, and the exhibition of films. They owned the theaters. So this resulted in pretty much total control of the film industry in the United States by the studios. And this policy of vertical integration was eventually scrapped following monopoly trial against the studios in 1948, which determined that studios couldn't be vertically integrated this way, that they had to allow competitors to have access to things like distribution and exhibition, like theaters. So as a result of this decision in 1948, the studio system began to lose its power, and by 1960, it was pretty much finished as in the form that it had been for all those years, since 1912. Now, one of the key figures in the early years of the Hollywood studio system was D.W. Griffith. Griffith was born in Kentucky in 1875. He started to try his hand as a playwright. He also performed as an actor in various plays, but he eventually drifted into working in cinema. He began directing films in 1908, and he was responsible for the first Hollywood film, the first film shot in Hollywood, Old California, in 1910. So even predating the emergence of the first studios, Griffith was actually shooting out there. Probably 1914. 1914's Judith of Bethulia was the first film that indicated that he had aspirations to create major feature films rather than short films, and he was responsible in part for introducing these larger, longer films to Hollywood. But really, what Griffith is probably best known for now is his rather shameful film, The Birth of a Nation. I say shameful, and that's kind of an understatement, but The Birth of a Nation from 1915 was basically a story of the Civil War in the United States and the aftermath during the period of reconstructing the South following the American Civil War. But what's perhaps best known about that film, about Birth of a Nation, is how tremendously racist the film is, and how violently it was opposed by groups like the NAACP and so on, who objected to the way in which the film valorized or glamorized the Ku Klux Klan and demeaned and debased African Americans. President Woodrow Wilson apparently, and this is up for some debate. It doesn't appear to be true, but the legend was that Woodrow Wilson claimed that it was like writing history with lightning, and that his only regret was that it was all so terribly true. Now, one of the things that characterized Birth of a Nation, aside from the virulence of its racism, was its willingness to present actors in blackface, white actors in blackface, rather than hiring African Americans for many of the key roles. And this was a practice that Hollywood maintained for many years. It was a shameful aspect of Hollywood's history, but it's also worth mentioning that that shameful history was not exclusively Hollywood's. It was also an element of American society, blackface and obviously racism. I'd suggest, though, that there is an alternative or counter history that we can propose that, in a sense, is a reaction against Birth of a Nation and the representation of race that Birth of a Nation presented. This is the period in the early 19 teens when we see the emergence of what were known as race films. These were films that were primarily made by white film production companies or white-owned production companies for screenings in white-owned theaters in predominantly black neighborhoods. But some of these films were also produced by small, independent, African-American owned companies who made these films dealing with the reality of black life in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, or at least the reality as it could be presented in film. One important group connected to these race films was a group known as the Colored Players. These were all black casts, but with white crews and white directors. And they made several films in the 1920s, such as The Scar of Shame in 1929 or 10 Nights in a Bar Room in 1926, which, aside from having a great title, is also kind of a classic of this sort of subgenre of films. One of the most important figures in all of this history is Oscar Micheaux. Oscar Micheaux was born in South Dakota in 1884. He wrote a number of novels and then would sell these books to African American customers or consumers door to door. So he'd travel around with his books and would try to sell these books to various folks around his area in the U.S. He formed the Micheaux Book and Film Company in 1918, which produced about 30 films over the course of a decade. So from 1918 until roughly 1928, Micheaux was responsible for the production of a rather large number of films that dealt with issues such as interracial marriage or lynching or just general racist policies and attitudes in the United States. Most of those films are now lost, which is a tremendous shame. The quality of the films was actually surprisingly high. And I say surprisingly because these were very low budget productions. Michaud died in 1951, but he wasn't awarded his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame until 1987, which is quite an enormous gap, really, when you think about it. Sort of an oversight on the part of film historians up until 1987. This is a poster for The Homesteader from 1919, and this would have been a performance or a screening of the film that would have been for black audiences. Here's the title card from Michaud's answer to Birth of a Nation, the symbol of the unconquered, a story of the Ku Klux Klan. And one of the things that I think is most exciting about recent developments in film archive work is the rediscovery of and the redistribution of many of these films by Oscar Michaud and other black filmmakers from the U.S. There's a terrific boxed set of early African American filmmakers that came out a few years ago, put out by Kino. If you're interested in this at all, and these are primarily short films, some excerpts or scraps from some films, the rest of which has been lost, and so on. So if you get a chance to take a look at those, you might want to. Now, the other follow-up to all of this, after Michaud dies, and we have the consolidation of Hollywood and the introduction of the Jim Crow laws and so on, and then the rejection of and at least in name the dismantling of the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. in the 1960s with the civil rights movements and so on. One of the effects of this was a re-emergence of African American filmmakers. But the process was relatively slow, and it starts really with the blaxploitation film. This is a term that was coined in the 1970s, but these were films that were launched in the 1970s after Melvin Van Peebles released his film Sweetback's Badass Song, which was a remarkably popular blaxploitation film released in 1971. These blaxploitation films became, sort of cult classics in recent years. These were films that were catered towards black audiences, specifically after the political upheavals of the 1960s. And black audiences loved these films because they presented black characters to black audiences in contemporary settings and facing many of the problems that urban blacks were facing at the time. The films were criticized, however, for their violence, their emphasis on crime, and for some reliance on stereotypes. But the films, as I say, were still quite popular. Some audiences, some African American audiences, felt that these films presented a kind of cinematic hero for African American theater goers. These cinematic heroes who were again the sort of counter to the white Hollywood version of the classic hero character. So if you get a chance, you might want to check out Superfly from 1972, which is really a lot of fun. Cleopatra Jones, which is just a terrifically interesting film, and the weirdest and maybe the most fun of these, Blackula from 1973. The posters for these are particularly cool. This is the poster for Superfly from 1972. Other films like Shaft for example. Now, one problem that we run into in representations of race in Hollywood is the reliance upon what we could perhaps call race tropes. These conventional, stereotypical characters whom we see in many mainstream films produced by production companies in the United States. For example, we have the sassy black woman here, represented by Tyler Perry as Medea. We also have the so-called magical Negro, the black character who has access to magical powers or sort of arcane wisdom and things like this. Morgan Freeman is often cast in roles like this. Christopher Farley in Time magazine had this to say about these sort of stereotypical portrayals of black characters. He says, because most Hollywood screenwriters don't know much about black people other than what they hear on records, instead of getting life histories or love interests, black characters get magical powers. And so there's again this kind of looking at black characters through white eyes. This isn't something that is entirely restricted to black characters, though. I mean, we find throughout Hollywood the portrayal of characters who are non-white in ways that rely on these race tropes, these superficial, stereotypical images that are function as a kind of shorthand, a misleading shorthand, obviously. So we have the magical Asian character, if any of you have seen films like Gremlins or something like that, or the Hispanic maid, the role that seems to go to, or at least used to go to Latina and Latino performers as the domestic servants and so on. Now, there's been a number of attempts to kind of explain how Hollywood has, or to give examples of how Hollywood has portrayed race issues. One of the things that's particularly interesting, this is a pie graph looking at films from 2007 to 2014, that discovered that 73.1% of characters in Hollywood films in that period were white. And then we have a breakdown of 12.5 for black, 5.3 for Asian, 4.9 for Hispanic, and 4.2 for the ever popular other category. So the representations of non-white characters of people of color don't correspond, obviously, to the breakdowns in the demographics of America, not even close to that. Now, this sort of what we could perhaps call, and we will in a second, whitewashing in film, goes back quite a long ways, obviously. I mean, I've already mentioned Birth of a Nation and the use of white actors in blackface. But one of the most pernicious of the portrayals of race in early Hollywood films is the portrayal of Theda Bara, silent actor who became known as sort of the Hollywood vamp, the first example of the woman who is a destructive force, who's irresistible and sexually alluring and drives men mad with lust and so on. This is usually traced back to the actor Theda Bara, who was born Theodosia Burr, which is probably one of the best names ever. But when she arrived in Hollywood, she was given this new name. Now, there's a lot of debate still about the origin of Theda Bara, but so one version of it has that it was revealed that her one of her grandparents had the last name Barrington, I think it was, and that Theda was what Theodosia Burr was called as a child. That was her pet name from her parents and so on. But Hollywood Studios, the Hollywood studio with which she was associated, decided that a better version of this was to point out that Theda Bara was an anagram for Arab death. And so there was this attempt to portray Arabic character, and she was presented as being of Arabic ethnicity, an Arabic character played by a white woman, and then just to kind of stick the knife in that anagram of Arab death as a way of sort of emphasizing her exoticness and her the danger of this woman of color, who obviously wasn't really portrayed by a woman of color. D.W. Griffith again shows up in 1919 with a brilliant example of whitewashing. This is a picture of Richard Barthelmess in Broken Blossoms, in which Barthelmess played a very stereotypically Chinese character in makeup, disguised as a Chinese character, and obviously a white man. The character himself is so stereotypical. He smokes opium. He's presented as being slightly effeminate and so on. More recently, of course, we have things like Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Here we see Jake Gyllenhaal looking not at all Persian, and probably most famously in recent years, at least, Scarlett Johansson's performance in Ghost in the Shell, in which she was supposed to be playing a character who was a Japanese woman, and obviously she's Scarlett Johansson, right? So the response to Scarlett Johansson being cast in Ghost in the Shell, I think this is a brilliant one. Apparently in Hollywood, Japanese people can't play Japanese people anymore. So in recent years, what we've seen, in contrast to the kind of predominantly or exclusively white portrayals or characters that Hollywood is focused on, we see a surge in films made specifically for and about black audiences and made by black filmmakers. So these films have risen in popularity, and I think that this is a really positive development. We have in these films a lot of characters who subvert the stereotypes that we often see in films with black characters. It's been suggested that we're kind of witnessing a renaissance of black films. So films like Straight Outta Compton, Moonlight, which obviously won the Best Picture Oscar in that really bizarre Academy Awards ceremony of a few years ago, Black Panther, which I'm sure many of you have seen, Selma, about the civil rights marches in the 1960s, and today's film Get Out by Jordan Peele. So what I'd ask you to think about while watching today's, actually no, what I should mention before getting to the questions to focus on is that we're also seeing an emergence of and a boom in films made by other people of color, right? So Chinese directors, Asian directors, we're seeing a lot of films being produced by South Asian directors from the South Asian diaspora and so on. So this emergence of or boom in the production of films by people of color isn't exclusively, in the United States at least, isn't exclusively limited to African American filmmakers. But I would suggest that African American filmmakers and films that are specifically directed towards or geared towards black audiences represent a really dramatic change in the way in which Hollywood is portraying or dealing with the issue of race. And Get Out is probably one of the most impressive examples of that. So, what I'd like you to do while you're watching the film at your leisure at home, a couple of things I'd like you to think about. First off, I'd like you to think about the way in which the film uses various metaphors and symbolism to talk about the nature of race and race representations in the United States. In particular, think perhaps of the use of cotton in the film and the references to black mold and things like that. But pay attention to these metaphors, these symbols, things like the number of deer heads that we see mounted on the walls and so on. I'd ask you to think about the ways in which the film subverts stereotypes and common representations of black characters. How does the film shift our perceptions of these characters? How does the film resist or reject stereotyping? Third question I'd ask you to think about is the role of Get Out in relation to genre. Is the film a horror film, a comedy film, a social thriller? It's even been suggested that it's a documentary, although I think, as we've seen in our discussion of the documentary, there are attributes that perhaps don't quite fit with that. But I'd ask you to think about the film in particular in relation to the horror genre. One of the ideas put forward in relation to the horror film comes from the Canadian critic Robin Wood, who talks about what he calls the return of the repressed in the horror film. Wood argues that the horror film looks at aspects of our society that we've repressed, that we've concealed, that we've chosen not to look at, not to address. But in the horror film, those things get to come back as the monster, as this terrifying figure. So I'd ask you to think about the way in which the film presents us with this return of the repressed. Obviously, we can also think about Get Out in terms of stylistic hegemony, which we've talked about. And in particular, in relation to this idea of stylistic hegemony and whether or not the film breaks with that, I'd ask you to think about the use of point of view shots, the number of times that we get to see through a character's eyes, so to speak, and who the character is whose eyes we look through. I'd also ask you to think about who the monster is in the film in Get Out, who really is the monster, and lastly, to think about the ending. The film does have an alternative ending, which I think you can probably find relatively easily online. So I'd ask you to perhaps think about the ending that we're given and the ending that we could have been given but weren't. This alternate ending. So I'd ask you to think about all of those things while you're watching today's film. Now, next week, we're going to be taking a look at The Shape of Water, and the plan is to have you do some kind of assignment in relation to The Shape of Water instead of doing an in-class quiz. Now, I'm just waiting for approval from the department and so on for that to go through, and I will let you know as soon as I find out how it is that we'll tackle that particular assignment. I just want to say at this point that I'm actually really disappointed that I'm not going to get to see you folks again before the end of term. I know that many of you will be graduating this summer, and congratulations on that. But my hope is that we'll get through this by summer, and that we'll actually be able to have some summer courses that people can take as well. But I am disappointed that we're not going to get to hang out for 3 hours for the next 2 weeks, plus the in-class quiz, which is always a lot of fun for me, if not for you. Anyway, I hope you enjoy Get Out. If you haven't seen it already, if you have seen it, I hope that you get to enjoy it from a different perspective, from the perspective of the weight of this course, so to speak. So enjoy the film, wash your hands,